This video is all about the elements of narrative fiction, and so you'll want to make sure that you have your paper ready so that you can take notes on these elements. And we're going to go through this video, and hopefully it will help you understand some of the elements we'll be using this year. Now here is your assignment. So while you're watching the video, I want you to complete the following. Copy down each term and its definition in your notebook. That's important. You will need these throughout the year, so you need them in a safe place in your notebook. Bring your definitions to class on the date stated on your Edmodo assignment description. So you'll want to look on Edmodo, see when the due date is for these terms to be done, and you'll need to bring them to class. We will be using the definitions in class, and you'll receive a homework grade for completing them, so you want to make sure you get them done. Alright, so we're going to start with setting. Setting is the time and place of a story. Now, a lot of people think that setting is just place, but setting is also time. So you notice I've got several different settings listed here. It can be a regular setting like a school or the beach. It can be a fantasy, science fiction setting like Mars. And notice that it can be summer or winter, 1965, 2013. So setting encompasses a lot of different things that you need to know about the story. Next, we have static and dynamic characters. This is two separate terms. Static characters are characters that do not change throughout the course of the story. Often they are minor characters. So for example, down here at the bottom of your screen, you will see the three spirits from A Christmas Carol. And those spirits pretty much are the same throughout the course of the story. Now they do undergo maybe some minor changes, but they pretty much stay the same during their time in the story. So they're what we call static characters. Dynamic characters, on the other hand, they undergo a major change by the end of the story. They are usually your main characters. So again, on the right-hand side of the screen, I have Ebenezer Scrooge. He is a dynamic character from A Christmas Carol. And you'll see at the top, you kind of see him in his old grumpy stage. And then at the bottom, you see how he's changed. He's now a more friendly, generous kind of character. So he is definitely what we would call a dynamic character. Next, we have external and internal conflict. Again, these are two separate terms. Remember that the conflict is the problem in the story. So an external conflict is a problem that the character has with an outside force. It can be another character, it can be nature, it can be technology, society, anything that's outside of the character himself or herself. Now, internal conflict is a problem the character has with himself or herself. It can be grief, jealousy, self-esteem. There's a variety of internal conflicts that a character can experience. So if you look here at the bottom left of your screen, you see Mr. Krabs and Plankton from SpongeBob, and that is definitely an external conflict. You can see they're fighting. They do not get along. But on the right, this is the episode of SpongeBob where he wants to play on the hooks and Mr. Krabs has told him not to. So he's having an internal conflict with himself because he wants to do this thing, but he knows he's not supposed to, and so he's having the trouble with making a decision on what he should do there. So internal conflict here on the right, external on the left, and you can have both within the same story, so that's important to remember also. Alright, next we have our plot elements, and we've got 5 different plot elements here. They are all individual terms, so you want to make sure you get all 5 of these on your notes. And we will be doing a little bit different assignment on plot elements to help you understand each of these different ones a little bit later. Alright, first you have your initiating event, part of the exposition. This includes background information, and it also is the event that gets the story going. This is what moves the story along from the very beginning, and this is where your conflict is introduced, where your problem is introduced. Next, we have our rising action. This is where the tension begins to rise, your conflict is becoming more challenging, and your character is experiencing more difficulty with this conflict that he or she is dealing with. Now, our climax. This is the turning point in the story. Now, some people say it's the highest point of suspense, and that can be true. but it is definitely the turning point. And at the climax, the plot is going to change one way or the other, either for the better or for the worse. So it's going to go one way or the other. We also have our falling action, and this occurs just after the climax. This is where your story elements begin to calm down. The climax is over, and now we're going to move towards some kind of closure. And then finally, the resolution. And the resolution is the solution to the conflict, hopefully. And this is where you're tying up loose ends in the story. So this is the closing everything up, giving your character some closure after the climax, and tying up everything up nicely, hopefully. So those are your 5 plot elements. All right, theme. Theme is the overall message or lesson about life that you find in a story. It is a general statement that can apply to many stories. Now, I've given you here in red, I've given you an example of a theme. People rarely change their values and beliefs unless influenced by a traumatic event. Now, under that, I've given you 5 different stories that also have that theme. Now, even though these stories are very different, as one of their themes, they have this statement that I have in red. So, for example, in A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge would not have changed had he not experienced the traumatic event of being exposed to those spirits and to seeing what they had to present to him about his life. In It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey is a character who is unhappy with his life and frustrated with everything, and it isn't until he sees what the world would be like without him that he undergoes a change, and that's the traumatic event for him. In How the Grinch Stole Christmas, his traumatic event, he's on that cliff, he's about to die, and all the presents are about to go over with him, and he is in that tense moment where he realizes that Christmas is really about something that you feel inside and not about the gifts and everything else. And so he changes. In The Lion King, Simba at the beginning of The Lion King, remember, is proud and he's cocky and he's ready to be king and he wants everything to be all about him. And it isn't until his father dies and he feels guilty and feels responsible for that, that he ends up learning about what being a king is really all about. And so he changes his belief system there. And then in Finding Nemo, remember the father, Finding Nemo, is very protective, overly protective of Nemo. And it isn't until Nemo gets lost and he has to go find him that he realizes that he needs to let go in order to allow Nemo to grow and allow him to have a life. So notice that all 5 of those stories are very different, but they have the same theme. So remember that when you're thinking about theme. Okay, foreshadowing. Foreshadowing occurs when there is a hint to something that will happen later on in the story. And I've given you 3 examples here from The Wizard of Oz. During the tornado, we see the transformation of Miss Gulch into a witch on a broomstick, and that foreshadows that that witch is going to be Dorothy's enemy in Oz, because we already know that Miss Gulch presented a problem for her in Kansas. So that is our foreshadowing that the witch is going to be a problem for her. In Jaws, foreshadowing can be as simple as a sound. And the music that you hear when the shark is approaching, the dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun that everybody knows, foreshadows that something's going to happen every time you hear that sound. In Bambi, the death of Bambi's mother, that is foreshadowed by their previous conversation about man threatening the forest. So at the beginning of the story, Bambi and his mother have a conversation about man and how man is threatening them and threatening the forest, and that foreshadows that she will eventually be killed by man later on. Now, flashback is the opposite. Flashback is an earlier event or scene. It's a scene from the past that appears in a narrative out of chronological order, and it fills in information or explains something that's happening in the present. Now, in the movie The Sandlot, that entire movie is told in flashback by Scott Smalls as he tells you the story of his childhood. He is a announcer for baseball, and he tells you the story of his life. And so the entire movie is told in flashback. You don't know that really until the end. Now, in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you've got Willy Wonka experiencing several times in the film when he relives moments from his childhood. So he has major flashbacks during the tour where you see some explanation about why he is the way he is, and you see some information about his childhood. Both of those are different kinds of flashbacks. All right, irony. Okay, irony is the difference between the appearance of things and reality. And there are three types, and I do want you to get down all three types. We have verbal irony, and this is when the words that someone says are meant to mean something other than what they seem to say. In other words, sarcasm. So if somebody is wearing a dress and you really hate it and you say, wow, that's a pretty dress, verbal irony. Situational irony is when events come together in an expected or surprising way and often includes coincidence. And I just noticed you got an extra 2 there, so we're just going to draw a little line right through that here, I think, because we don't need that come together. So we'll just draw a line through that. Okay, so situational irony includes coincidence, and it can be when things happen in a way that you did not expect them to happen. So it's kind of the opposite of what you expect to happen. And then dramatic irony is when the reader knows something that the characters do not know yet. So if you are watching a movie and you know something, like you know the killer's on the other side of the door, for example, and the character doesn't know that, that's an example of dramatic irony. And it allows you to experience something that is different than what the character is experiencing. Okay, symbolism. Symbolism is when something stands for something outside of itself, giving special meaning to objects, events, or relationships. In the SpongeBob movie, King Neptune's crown is a symbol for his power. There's also the joke that it's a symbol for, him losing his hair. But for him, it's a symbol of his power. In the TV show Matlock, which a lot of you probably aren't familiar with, he is a lawyer, and he is very particular about his suit. And there is an episode where they convince him to wear a different suit, and he is not capable of functioning in the courtroom, and he actually has to leave court, go and change, put on his suit that is special to him, and then he can function in the courtroom. And so that suit gives him confidence. It's a symbol of his confidence in the courtroom. And then in the movie WALL-E, the plant is a symbol for life, and it's what all the humans are searching for when they come and they send out the little robots to search for life. That plant is a symbol for life. Okay, a subplot. We talked about plot earlier. A subplot is a secondary, less important storyline happening alongside the main plot. And an example can be found in the original Star Wars, and Han Solo's debt to Jabba the Hutt is a story in its own right, with Han as the main character. The subplot eventually merges with the main plot when Luke wants to save Princess Leia. So Han's plot is that he's got this debt to Jabba the Hutt. It's the reason that he takes Luke on as a client in the first place, because Luke agrees to pay him a lot of money. And this converges when Luke wants to save Princess Leia, and it all comes together eventually. So that subplot with Han is different than Luke's subplot, which is learning the Force and finding out who he really is. Voice, tone, and mood. 3 separate terms. Okay, so you want to make sure you get all 3. Voice is who the readers hear talking in the writing. It is the personality of the writing. Tone is the attitude of the writer toward the subject or the readers. And mood is the atmosphere created by the writing. It is the feeling the reader gets by reading the words. For example, now down at the bottom I've given you 3 examples. If there's a story with a thunderstorm, lots of lightning and rain and dark clouds, it creates an eerie mood. It creates kind of a scary mood. Usually, horror movies, they take place in the dark. You don't usually see a lot of horror movies taking place in the middle of the day. So They give you that fog and dark clouds and rain and all that darkness to create the eerie mood. Shrek. Shrek has a silly tone at the beginning, even though there's some seriousness there with rescuing the princess. At the beginning, there's a lot of silliness that happens when you see where Shrek lives and what he does, and everything is kind of backwards from what you would expect. And so there's that silly tone that underlies everything that happens in Shrek. Now, on the far right, that's a picture of my daughter Courtney, and I put that for voice because when she writes something, I can hear her voice. I know her. I know how she expresses herself, and so even if her name is not on something, I usually can tell that it's her because I can hear her voice, hear the way she would say things and the way she would express herself. So if you get familiar with a writer, you will often hear that voice because that writer will become familiar enough to you that you'll recognize the style of writing. And you should have your own voice in your writing as well. Okay, our last one is point of view. And point of view is the angle from which a story is viewed. In other words, who's telling the story. There are 3 different points of view, and you do need to get down all 3. First person, in first person point of view, the one telling the story is directly involved in the story. The speaker is a character in the story. He or she is telling you what happened to him or her. This is what happened to me. This is my story. I did this. I said this. I felt this. In third person limited, the one telling the story is not a character in the story. The reader will know the thoughts and feelings of one character only. Sarah went to the store. She saw her best friend. They had been fighting. Sarah didn't know how to react to seeing her friend. But we don't know how the friend is feeling. Now, in third person omniscient, the one telling the story is not a character in the story, just like in third person limited. And the reader will know the thoughts and feelings of all the characters in the story. So in this type of point of view, I would know how Sarah's feeling. I would know how the friend is feeling. So we'd know how everybody's feeling and what everybody's thinking. So those are your 3 types of point of view. So take your terms. You're going to bring them to class with you, and we will be doing an activity with those terms to help you practice just a few of them, not all of them at the same time, but we'll be practicing a few of them. So those are your elements of narrative fiction.